and welcome to Dip In and Out with Lucy, the podcast that opens up the discussion around domestic abuse. I'm very fortunate this lovely morning to be sitting down with Mark Woodland, and as is probably best, I'm going to hand over to Mark to explain a bit more about what he does, and and we'll kick off from there. Good morning, Mark.
Okay, good morning, Lucy. You okay?
Yes, good, thank you.
Good. Okay, it could be a bit complicated. So we'll start with what I am at the moment. Currently, I'm employed within Greater Manchester Police, but I'm not a police officer. I work as a victims services coordinator, which is a strategic post, basically ensuring that victims of crime get the best possible support offer. That's all types of crime, but obviously including domestic abuse. And that's working with the police, local authority, third sector, statutory, and just making sure they're all kind of pulling in the same direction to give the best support possible. In terms of, I know what we're going to be chatting about this morning, my background, initially 22 years in the army, but 20 years in total in occupational welfare. Trained as a relate trained counsellor, also trained as what's called a solution-focused brief therapist, which is what's going to kind of centre on this morning. And I always kind of describe solution-focused brief therapy as a counsellor who's an annoying optimist.
Yeah.
So it's a set of tools that can be, if you like, given to an individual, not just for the time they need it, but for the rest of their life, that they can pick out and utilise to improve on any situation they've got. So we'll cover some of those this morning, I think.
Brilliant. That's exactly what I was going to lead into. Thank you very much. And a lot in a career is very much what I normally would talk about is with different professionals would be the challenges and the obstacles that individuals face when it comes to talking about domestic abuse or how they move forward with their life or what's happening to them at that point, or potentially that they don't even know it's happening. And I think what's lovely about this morning is we're talking more about that solution focus, and it's a term that kind of explains itself, I suppose, but do you want to explain a bit more about what solution focus is?
Yes, certainly. I mean, you know, I've had 20 years of sitting in a room opposite someone who's had the courage to kind of put their hand up and say help and sit in the other chair. And the whole premise of solution focused is that on such an occasion, there is more than one expert in the room. The expert in that individual's life is them, not you. You know, I'm never the expert in somebody else's life. And the premise is that the wisdom, the expertise, the coping strategies, and the strength required for all of that is actually within that individual.
Yeah.
But it has been, if you like, mislaid because, if you like, we have two parts to our brain. We have the logical side, the rational logical side, and we have the emotional side, which is wonderful because it's what makes us human. But the two parts of the brain don't run concurrently. So if we are in a real kind of emotional mix of things going on, it's incredibly difficult to find the time, the energy, the opportunity to kind of sit down and say to ourselves, right, okay, this is what the problem is. This is what needs to change. This is what I'm going to do about it. We kind of lose that. So solution focus is about helping to ground someone in the first place and then give them tools that they can visualize or they can use on a piece of paper, and they can start, if you like, to see the wood for the trees and think, right, okay, I can't sort all of it in one go, but I've identified this element. I can deal with that now by doing this and this. So I'm going to do that. And then I'm going to see what it all looks like after that and take it one step at a time.
You know, what's brilliant about that as well is because that just in a nutshell sums up the experience for the majority of victims and survivors of domestic abuse, isn't it? There's so many layers, there's so many factors. And I think sometimes as society, it's hard for people to understand, you know, it's not just a case of, well, you're no longer in that situation anymore, move on. You know, there's a lot of things that then, and especially why I talk so much about post-separation abuse, is it's all the things that go with that person. They don't just leave it at the doorstep. You know, it carries on with them, and it could be lots of different agencies involved. It could be, you know, their mental health, if they're having to process the fact that they've actually experienced abuse because that's normal to them, that's been their life. You know, there's so many layers and so many other things that are going on that actually, you're right, you know, when you say seeing the wood for the trees, that's exactly it. It's trying to think, how am I going to cope with all this that's going
Yeah.
on?
Well, nobody sits down and says, the thing I need to address is the fact that I'm the victim of domestic abuse, full stop. Actually, you know, this is now impacted on my family relationship, sense of isolation, on my finances, on my children and their schooling, on my mental health, on a whole load of, if you like, ripples that fall out from that central explosion of being a victim of domestic abuse. And they will all need sometimes different solutions, maybe different people and organizations, as you say, Lucy, in order to get as holistic a move forward as we can get someone as close to point B as we can.
And exactly, and having those mechanisms in place, because I think we had this conversation off camera maybe a few weeks ago when we were talking about, you know, the fact that if you have these things in place, when something inevitably, as in life in general would, but especially if you're experiencing post-separation abuses, something will come out of the blue more often than not that you aren't expecting, i.e. stalking and harassment, an application to the family court, a phone call from children's services, whatever it is, you know, the mortgage isn't being paid anymore or whatever. There's a million and one things that could be going on that could add to that layer of problems, isn't it? And so if you've already got that kind of focus in place of how you can manage those problems, and we're not, like you say, you're not saying it's just removing everything, it's okay, well, let's take this one step at a time. And that to me is the only way you can do it and the only way you can process any of it.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, it's probably a bad analogy, but if I served up for you a plate of spaghetti bolognese, it would be totally unreasonable for me to say, right, eat it all in one go, in one
Yeah.
mouth.
Although I don't know with me.
Okay, that was a bad analogy.
I didn't
But
want pasta. No.
but it's that thing of, you know, we can't problem solve
Yeah.
everything in one go, but often we just see just one massive, great big problem, that it's just one entity, and actually it's not. And solution focus has a number of ways of breaking that down and saying, right, well, okay, we're not going to try and, you know, deal with 100% on day one, but we've broken it down, and here's something that, say, is approximately 5%. Let's have a go at that. And quite often what you then find is you deal with that 5% and you might not get it down to zero, you might get it down to 2%.
Yeah.
But what you'll see is when you look at the other 95%, it's impacted positively on other things that make that 95% up. So you get this snowball effect, and you also get the confidence because you think, well, it worked for that, so I can do it. I have done it. Okay, what's the next thing that I need to look at and make some positive impact upon?
Yeah, and that's exactly, isn't it? That it isn't impossible, because I think so often when for victims and survivors, it's that lack of self-worth, lack of self-esteem, thinking that they can't do anything, and potentially, as you say before about the isolation from family and friends, you know, very often they've lost that sense of self, of who they are, because, and again, with coercive control, you know, the perpetrator has had that power and control for so long that maybe they don't think it is possible, and they are overwhelmed, and it is all too much. And that's where I think it's really important, like you say, to have that step by step. And I love that idea that even if you only get it down to 2% in one area, it will have had that impact on others. So without even realizing it, you bring in all those other areas down, even if it's a fraction.
Yeah.
Maybe that will be enough for you to manage that day, let alone that week or month.
Yeah, and you hit the nail on the head, because this is so much also tied in with self-esteem, which takes such a knocking within an abusive relationship over a prolonged period of time, you know, and we build up this kind of psychology of learned helplessness. And when we start doing things for ourselves, we start to rebuild slowly, step by step, but we start to rebuild that self-esteem in a way that we can't actually deny, because we are doing things that are specifically for us as an individual. And that is self-valuing, that is self-esteem building, and that is us telling ourselves, proving to ourselves, I am worth the effort.
Yeah.
You know, I might not have felt I have been for however long, but actually I am, and I'm going to start turning this around and doing things that are for me, because actually, if I do things for me, I'm also doing those things for my children and the people that I love around me, because you can't pour from an empty glass. You know, you can only give to your children, you can only give to other important people in your life if something is going into your kind of emotional bank account in order to be able to pay out for others.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, I wish I'd have organised this episode um, for Mental Health Awareness Week. Now, it is Mental Health Awareness Week now. When this comes out, it won't be. But it's a brilliant kind of, for me, this makes so much sense in terms of talking about it now. And one thing, again, we don't talk about is that self-care. You're right. You know, if a father, mother is trying to balance, as I always call it, 50,000 plates, you know, because that's how it feels for them. They're trying to balance so many things, be a good parent, maybe try and overcompensate for the parent that isn't, you know, as involved, which potentially maybe the perpetrator's parent. Whatever's going on, there's so much that they can feel that there isn't an answer. But if they have these kind of things in place, that is just going to make all the difference. But at the same time as having all those things in place, they also need to be able to say, actually, I need to go and stand back now and go and have a bath, go for a walk for 10 minutes, take time out. You know, it's those things, isn't it, that like you just said, you can't pour from an empty glass if you don't have that self-care. And again, it's trying to explain, isn't it, to those who've experienced abuse, you're not being selfish.
No,
You're not being selfish.
if I had a quid for every time I've said to a client, this isn't selfish, it's self-care.
Yes.
And really start to think about the difference between the two.
Yeah.
You know, and also, you know, if you have children, you are educating your children all the time.
Yeah.
So if you are, let's say, a single mum because you're the victim of domestic abuse and you've managed to escape that relationship, and let's say you have young daughters, but actually the message is also very strong for young sons.
Yeah.
Then if you show your young daughters that mum takes time out for herself, she treats herself to things. It might be a hot bath with scented candles and
Exactly.
right, I'm offline for half an hour, whatever. You are giving a very powerful message to your children, a positive one there. But if you don't do those things, you are also sending a very positive message to your children. And it's a ticking time bomb for their adult life, because actually, if the message they're receiving as a young child is, you know, as a wannabe mum, you know, as a little girl, I want to be like mum,
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm not worth the time, then what does that do to the risk factor in terms of going into relationships and finding yourself to be a victim of domestic abuse as well? Because the boundaries haven't been set, because you weren't able early on to see the red flags and say, whoa, just a minute, that is not acceptable.
Yeah.
That needs to change. And if that can't change, then I will be walking away.
Yeah.
So they're incredibly important messages that we give to our children as well.
Absolutely. And I think sometimes, again, what I would love to see more is that understanding from parents that there is help out there, there is support. One of the many, many reasons I have the resources page I have, and it's constantly growing, is to prove that point that, you know, it's not just the odd charity here, they're everywhere. There is support everywhere, and not just for the parents, for the children as well. You know, there are children and young people, workers who are out there doing amazing work, helping those children have those boundaries. Because again, you know, we often think of the parents being the victims or survivors of abuse, but the children, there's just no way they can't be impacted if they've lived in that environment, you know.
And with the new DA Act, you know, that is now
Yeah.
being put into legislation that children are victims of domestic abuse within their own right.
Absolutely. And
Let's
that's
not get it
where
wrong.
they need, and sometimes I think with parents, when they are trying to spin all those plates, when they are trying to deal with so many challenges, to then try and kind of counsel your child when you don't even really understand it yourself, because you're still trying to process it potentially through your own counselling, group support, whatever you're, you know, whatever you're doing. But if you have that balance of, say, have your child have that external support, that external intervention, the child can then see things. Sometimes children listen better to a complete stranger, a teacher, whoever, than they do their own. But you can ask your child to pick their shoes up or socks up 50,000 times and they don't listen. But if a teacher said it, they do it straight away. So
but also with young children who have recently effectively lost one parent because there's been a marital split, post-domestic abuse, they are going to feel very naturally clingy and more insecure about, well, what about my remaining parent? Is the same kind of thing going to happen again? And when it comes to having those honest conversations with the parent with care, they might well feel protective towards that parent, not want to ask questions or say things that they think might actually heighten their own risk and insecurity. So that's where a professional third party really does come in, because it's someone safe who can sit down, who has an understanding, who can acknowledge all that needs to be acknowledged, but isn't going to, provide that risk of, well, I don't want to say that to mummy or to daddy, because if I do and I upset them, then that rocks my world as well. So I'll just keep quiet.
And then they carry that with them.
Yeah, and I've always kind of said, around my kind of late work, which is mostly kind of in the army, is upon marital split, always be very, very mindful of the child who's not talking, the child who's not crying, the child who is just keeping it all inside, because it's not a healthy thing for any of us to do. We need to find safe ways to cathartic. And as a parent, we need to try and find a way that our children can safely communicate out their hurt, their anger, their fears, in a way that they don't feel, I wish I hadn't.
Absolutely. Oh God, yes. And to not, and I think again it's similar for the parents, is for the child, is not feel ashamed. We need to step away from this idea, as we have done quite successfully with mental health in recent years, is to say it's okay to not be okay. We hear that all the time, don't we?
Yes.
Well, it's also okay not to be okay when you've experienced abuse, because of course there is that link between your mental health, because how could it not impact on you psychologically, especially if one of the main components of the abuse you've experienced is psychological abuse. We often think of the physical, but the psychological is the things that leave the scars there that you are constantly having to manage and process potentially for the rest of your life. And not to be ashamed of that, and for children not to feel ashamed that, oh, well, my friend's parents are still together. Is it my fault? Did I do something wrong? Was I naughty? Is that why they argued? Is that why things happened the way they did? And again, to stop all that internalization, it is important that children have that outlet. And I think if parents know that you can pick up the phone, you can go online, you can find those places where there is support and that compassion and understanding, and that could give your child the potential of a life where they do have boundaries and say, no, that's not acceptable to me. Sorry, no. As opposed to saying, well, I don't want to say anything because, if I say something, this is my childhood all over again, And I was going to lead into, when you were saying before about trying to pour from an empty glass, I think that leads in nicely to a brilliant analogy, which I'm going to let you explain, because I love it. I'm a doctor.
Okay.
Well,
yeah, I mean, I did give you that feed, but you missed it. Never mind.
I know. You know what we're like? We go off. It's like those train tracks. We just go off at tangents.
We are terrible. Yeah, we're
Ronnie
bad.
Corbett.
So yeah, this is, I mean, usually with a client, this is something I get a piece of A4 paper and I draw it. This is the first time I've kind of described it, so I'm hoping it works.
It will.
So I want your listeners to imagine a glass, like a pint glass, not a fancy one with one of those umbrellas in, but like a straight pint glass. And we all have a glass. And in that glass go all the different things that that we might be worried about, that might be a stressor in some way, that is a demand on our life, that takes our energy and our time. And some of the things in that glass take up very little space. Some take up a lot of space. Some are in there for a day or two, short-term practical task, got to get it done, got to get the car serviced, you get it serviced, it's out of your glass. Other things might stay in your glass for the rest of your life. Something like a bereavement. Over a period of time, it might feel like it takes up less space in your glass as you adjust to the loss, but it's always going to be in there because it shapes how you make sense of the world, decisions that you make, so on and so forth. So all of those things stuck up in your glass. Also on your glass, and it can be higher up or it can be lower down, we'll put it at about the halfway mark, is a line called the comfort line. And whilst we feel the level in our glass is below the comfort line, we feel comfortable. We can deal with the things that are in our glass. We kind of know that they're there. And if something else slips into the glass today, we will respond to it in a sensible, adult, rational, socially acceptable sort of way. Life being life, sometimes it feels like the level in our glass is above the comfort line, and we start to feel uncomfortable. We might feel a bit agitated about one or two things. We might find that when we're trying to get to sleep at night, we have invasive thoughts about one of the things or more than one of the things that's in our glass, and so on and so forth, that we're not always present in the moment. Our mind's gone off somewhere else to think about, well, how's this going to work out, or whatever. And we'll call this part of the glass above the comfort line the world of stress. Okay. Sometimes it feels like the level of our glass is at the top. And we know, I think we all know what that feels like. That's the point where the next little thing that comes along. So we're late for work, we get in the car, we turn the ignition, nothing, battery's flat. There might be some naughty words that escape our mouth, regardless of whether anyone else is around or not. And our blood pressure has just gone up and we're producing adrenaline by the bucket load. But it's not simply the fact that the battery is flat in our car that we're reacting to. We're reacting to the entire volume in the glass that's kind of feels like it's overflowing. The dodgy car battery is fighting for space in that glass, for your attention, for your energy, along with everything else that's in there. Yeah. So we'll call that the point of distress. I hope we're getting beyond the kind of levels of stigma we've had around stress. That people say, well, I've got an important job and this and that and that. I don't feel stress. I don't get stress. Stress is for weak people. That's absolutely rubbish. Yeah. We all feel stress. And by the way, what stress is, there's no stress out there in the outside world. That's pressure. Those are pressures. Pressures out there only become stress in here when this processes it. Yeah. So and that's another opportunity we have. I won't go into that too much, but how we process it, how we allow ourselves to process pressure, how we interpret it in our head. And a lot of that comes from our childhood, what we've learned as little children, as to, what our parents did when something went wrong. And we copy that, we learn that, it becomes our norm. So at the point of distress, if we don't do anything, because, well, we don't get stressed, do we? So we don't need to do anything. And if you don't manage something, well, don't expect a positive change. Yeah. You like to start to feel increasingly apathetic and lethargic. It's more of an effort to do things, more of an effort to get out of bed in the morning. It's more of an effort to find joy in things. Everything is just more of an effort. And if we continue not to address or do anything, then we stand a pretty good chance of going into a reactive depression. And reactive depression is exactly the same as clinical depression, other than what's caused it in the first place. So reactive depression is all of those stressors that we have in our glass that we're not managing, that are not going away. And those stressors prompt the fight or flight or freeze, or fawn reaction. So our body then produces adrenaline, cortisol, other chemicals that ready our body to fight or run like the clappers. Trouble is, that's for when we lived in caves and there were dangerous animals out there. We haven't got any of that anymore, but we haven't evolved. We haven't had time to evolve as a species yet. So that adrenaline has nowhere to go. So it just runs around our body, day in, day out. And it affects things like our brain's ability to produce our main relax chemical, which is serotonin. And if we don't produce enough serotonin, we are depressed. That's clinical depression. Some people's brains don't produce enough serotonin. This is exactly the same, except we have caused that inability to produce enough serotonin because of the state of our glass.
Yeah.
So what I would do for clients, I would show that, and I would ask them at the moment, where do you feel you are on the glass? And what's your travel of direction? And because most people who knocked on my door, all people aren't going to say, well, life actually is a fantastic place. Thanks very much. Bye.
Yeah.
It's going to be pretty high up. And very often it feels like it's full. So I asked people to get a piece of A4 paper and put a line down the middle from top to bottom. And on the left-hand side, visualize your glass and think about all the different things that are in there that contribute towards it feeling so full. And give each one of those items a name between 1 and 3 words, no more. But don't put something like work, because that's too bland. Break it down. Work, you can put work, line manager, work, shift pattern, work, pay. So break it down a little bit. You don't have to do it in any particular order, the order that just comes into your head, and just write them down, write them down, write them down until you get to the point where you're sucking the end of your pen. Then you're done.
You're done.
Then go across to the second column and looking at the things you've listed, give them a size between 1 and 10. 1 is a minor issue, but it came into my head whilst I was doing the list, so I put it down. 10 is something when I go to bed and I'm trying to sleep, I can't because I'm thinking of this. When I wake up in the morning, the first thing I'm thinking of is this. When I take the kids down to feed the ducks on a Sunday afternoon, my body is there, but my mind is here. So that would be a 10. And you can have halves. Once you've done that, add up the total of all those numbers in the right-hand column. If your glass feels full, that is the capacity of your glass. So let's say it's 100. People often say, I can't see the wood for the trees. I don't know what to do. I don't know where to start. It's just kind of all encompassing. It's just all. Now we start to work on the left-hand column. And it's not about going for the biggest thing first. In fact, I used to kind of steer people away from doing the biggest things first, because what you want really from a practitioner point of view is some early success to build momentum and confidence.
Build and build,
So when you look at those things, some of them might require you to communicate with another person. Some of them might require you to say to somebody, when you do this or say that or don't do this, it has an impact on me. So are you able to change your behavior to change the impact upon me? Some of the things in our glass don't belong to us.
That's a very good point.
We've let them be poured into our glass. A lot of us are rescuers. I am. People who go into caring professions tend to be rescuers. They're not very good at looking after themselves. They're motivated to look after everybody else. So we have to think about the ownership of those things as well, whether we can give them back. Sometimes it might just be an adjustment in our own mind that actually, no, that's not in my glass. I'm not having that in my glass. So I'm discounting that, and I'm going to get a red pen and I'm just going to put a line through those words on the piece of paper, and it's gone. It's not mine. It's not always about getting those things from, let's say, a 7.5 down to a 0. You might only get that 7.5 down to a 4, but that's 3.5% of your glass recovered. Okay, and it's closer to getting towards the comfort line. And what you might find is when you've got that 7.5 down to 4, and you look at the other things, some of them might have adjusted their size as well, because it's all about perception.
Yeah.
And usually they come down. You think, well, I've dealt significantly with that, and now actually that doesn't feel as big. Instead of being an 8, that feels more like a 6. And we haven't even looked at it yet, but already it's gone down by 2. So you get this snowball effect of bringing things down. So look for some smaller, easier wins first of all. Right, I need to have a discussion with this person. Right, I need to write a letter to the bank or phone the bank, and it can require some brave things, yeah, to do at a time when you might not feel so brave and you might not feel so empowered.
Yeah.
But the best way to feel brave and feel empowered is to do brave things and empower yourself, because then you are proving to yourself, well, actually, I hadn't lost those things. I hadn't lost the ability to do it. I'd lost touch with it.
Yeah.
Maybe because for years someone had been telling me, you're no good at doing any of this.
Yeah.
You're
Yeah.
not strong enough to do this, to cope by yourself, and so on and so forth.
Mm.
Well, ultimately, someone sitting in a chair opposite, such as me, I cannot give anybody self-esteem. I cannot empty anybody's glass. All I can do is help someone to see and tap into the abilities they've always had
Yeah.
to do that themselves, to have a model by which to do that. So
God,
that's my stress glass, and I've used that. I've used that for 20 odd years.
I love it. I have, when you told me about it, I thought that's it right there, and works on so many levels for so many areas of life, but obviously in particular around domestic abuse, it is that solution to reducing that level of stress, the level of things that are going into glass. And I love that idea around there are things in your glass that aren't yours.
Yeah.
One of the things
And we can come on to that around assertiveness and language if you prompt me a
yes,
bit.
yeah. And one of the things I love around kind of the CYP work with children is that circle of control and what's within your control and what's without, what's not in your control. And
Yeah.
what isn't in your control is how other people behave, how other people treat you, and it isn't in your control. You can then work on those boundaries, like you say, saying, well, actually, one of the ones I love is, around saying no, because I think it's very hard for victims and survivors to say no. So having that way of saying, actually, not today, maybe to a friend now who maybe never realized they were quite controlling, or you just always were quite submissive in that friendship, say, but you're looking at your life now saying, actually, hang on a minute, maybe not today, actually, I'm doing X, Y,
Yeah.
and Z. And it's those little bits where, for those people, watching them take that control back. And when you said then about empowering and that feeling, once you watch somebody, and we'll have both seen it in work we've done, when you see somebody have that moment where they realize, I did that,
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
picked up that phone and made that, whatever it was that they did, that just, and it could be the smallest little thing, like, well, actually, I didn't have a cigarette this morning because that's one of my
Which is which is why it's so important that as the person who is supporting, you don't run around doing everything for that individual, because if you do, they don't get that feeling of, I have achieved this. They get the feeling of, you have achieved it for me.
Yeah.
So there's no legacy for future life in terms of, I know I can do this because 5 years ago I did something a whole load bigger, and I did that. Someone pointed me in the right direction, but I took the steps to get there. And if I did it, if I could do it then, I can do it now. And actually, I remember some of the tools, I remember some of the things I used to get me there.
That's
I
it.
just
That's
want to
exactly.
pick you up on one thing you said, actually, Lucy, and it's not to disagree with it.
We're allowed to disagree. Do you know what? That's one thing
No, we're
you've learned
not.
as well over many, many years, isn't it? Is you don't take offense. You just, I'm all good. I'm very zen these days. Go on.
You said that we can't change other people's behavior.
Mm.
And you're right, we can't change it per se, but we can certainly influence it. And we can also sometimes be very effective in stopping the behavior we don't like. So
Mm.
there's something called transactional analysis, and within that, there is PAC, parent, adult, child. I won't go into all this now because it'll take the rest of the podcast, but I'm going to recommend a book, if that's okay.
Absolutely.
Okay, I'm not getting commissioned
Yeah,
for
you're not
this.
getting anything from this.
And I have read it myself. So it's called Counseling for Toads.
I remember you telling me about this,
and
yeah.
it's by a chap called Robert de Board, Board, and it's based on The Wind and the Willows. So it has all the characters in The Wind and the Willows. So Toad, uh, Ratty, Badger,
Yeah.
Heron, the whole lot. And Toad goes to counselling, Heron's a counsellor, and all the other characters are friends with different dynamics, if you like, in Toad's
Right.
life. And it's based on a book which I wouldn't recommend people buying, by a guy called Eric Byrne, called The Games People Play. And we all play games. And some of them are very harmless and fine, and some of them actually are abusive, controlling, and are not fine. And a lot of those are present within controlling and coercive relationships. And someone who controls within a relationship, abuses within a relationship, is a bully. Okay? They're a bully. And bullies don't have the confidence to sustain communication and relationship dynamics as adult to adult. So they either slip down to their child ego state or up to their parental ego state and put pressure on the other person to shift as well.
Yeah.
So this book is all about, it's told as a story, it's not that long, but you will read it and you'll bump into bits and you'll think, blimey, that's happening in my life, or that has happened in my life. Now I understand what's going on. But it also kind of gives you things that you can do. So, if you have a bully, let's change it a little bit. A bully needs reaction.
Yeah.
They don't care if you get angry towards them because you've gone up to parent, or you become small, apologetic, tearful, you've gone down to child ego state. They're getting a reaction. Now, if, let's say, name a northern comedian.
Oh, it's got to be Peter Kay.
Okay, Peter Kay. Let's say that the Co-op Arena has finally been opened and he's going to do his live gigs there. Who knows? It might happen.
God, yeah.
Imagine he gets on stage and there's 20,000 plus people who've all paid a good amount of money to sit there and be entertained. And he comes onto the stage, it's a massive, great big spotlight on him. It's him and 20 plus thousand people. What a buzz. What a buzz that must be for him. And he tells his first half dozen jokes. Nobody laughs.
I can't believe that. I know what you mean.
Yeah, I know. Maybe not Peter Kay. And actually, a few people get up and they leave the arena. What do you think is going to be going through Peter Kay's mind? What's he going to be wanting to do?
Yeah, absolutely. He's just going to think, I want to, no, just no.
What keeps Peter Kay on that stage is the fuel that the audience is giving him. And when we are in an abusive relationship, and that can be a work relationship as well, it doesn't have to be a domestic relationship. Some of the time, not always, but some of the time, the behavior that we don't like, that is being pointed at us, we are unwittingly feeding it. We are encouraging the person to continue doing it because we're giving them their reward. We don't understand that that is their reward. And we don't stop giving it to them, so they keep on doing it. If we take that fuel away, eventually, what's the point? What's the point in them continuing like this because they're getting nothing from it, and they'll probably go and find somebody else, which isn't our problem.
No.
Okay.
No, and do you know, I completely agree with you, because I was just thinking then about, in terms of adults, I think for me, I suppose I'd like to see more education for children, because I think for children it is harder for them to deal with the change in behavior of the parent, because the parent will just say, well, I'm the parent, you're the child, deal with it.
Yeah.
So educating children in their own boundaries as well, in terms of how they can deal with it, because of course for them it will be harder for them to even imagine that they could change the parents' behavior. But for adults, once you realize that, like you say, once you take that reaction away, once you take that away from the perpetrator. And somebody once said to me something, and I loved it. They said about to somebody else about not giving it oxygen. And I just thought, I love that. You know, if the more oxygen you give it, the more time and attention you give that to the perpetrator, the more that you are feeding that and giving them precisely what they want.
Yeah.
And as much as, and I have said this so many times when I've worked in group facilitation or I've worked one-to-one, and you're talking to people and they'll say, yeah, but it's not fair, you know, but they're doing this, and no one's saying it's fair. No one is saying that their behaviour is fair and what they're doing is fair. But that first time you don't react, that first time you do stand back from the situation, I've often said, type out whatever you want in a text, type out whatever you want in an email, but don't send it. You know, if that's what you need to do to get that out of your system, absolutely, because it is very often it isn't fair behaviour, and it's very unjust. But at the same time, once you see that then they see they're not getting the reaction, they'll try and up it again, and then you don't react to that, and then you don't react to that.
And I think it's really important just to acknowledge that whilst there might be things you can do that impact positively on someone else's behavior, that other person's behavior is never your responsibility.
Yes,
It
absolutely.
is their responsibility. They are responsible for their behavior. You are merely trying to utilize tools, if you like, in a self-care way, in a self-protection sort of way, in a way of saying, hey, matey, you need to back off. You need to
Without saying it, I'm making it clear that that's not going to happen.
Without getting into an open conflict situation, obviously, which might increase risk. I'm keen. I've got a little note here with bits I'm really keen to kind of
yes,
cover,
go.
We've discussed beforehand. So I'd quite like to get on to kind of use of language and assertiveness.
Yes.
Okay, because I think they're incredibly empowering areas.
Yeah.
So language, I love language. Language it's incredibly powerful. One of the things I learned very early on in my army career, and in the army, the courses you go on as you get promoted up the ranks are excellent, and management within the army is really, really good. And language is a key part of that. So one of the most simple things around language is when we're talking to people where there might be some challenging, where there might be some difficult or adverse reactions, is to minimize I and you in the conversation. Because every time potentially you say you to somebody, it's like pointing your finger, you. Yeah. And when you say I, it's like bigging yourself up and saying I
feel this, I feel that, yeah.
So, you know, we and us, you know, we need to find a way forward here. We need to find a way for this dynamic to change, because it's not good for either of us. So straight away, you're not singling them out. You're not, you know, hitting their back up against a wall from which they might come out fighting, and you're not going to get
press the button,
solution. So that's incredibly important. Other bits of language. Let's look at, we'll come onto the word no, but first of all, we're going to look at the word sorry. That's a really problematic word, because as children, we are taught by our parents, if you do something wrong, you say sorry and you mean it. So say sorry, say sorry, say sorry. And we overuse it. So we nearly bump into somebody in Tesco's walking past the frozen peas. Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
We say it all the time, and we don't think any more of it. Trouble is, there's a bit of your brain that says, oh, situation's happened, I should be sorry. Mouth, say sorry. Yeah. So it says sorry, and we deliver that because that's part of our cognitive development from childhood. Where the difficulty comes in is that word sorry coming out of our mouth doesn't just go to the target who needs to know that we're sorry. It wraps itself around our face, goes into our own ears, and is processed by a different part of our brain. Part of a brain that understands that you say sorry when you've done something wrong. So how many times a day are we telling ourselves we've done something wrong? You've done something wrong again. You've done something wrong. You've done something wrong. And then we wonder why our self-esteem isn't quite where it should be. Yeah. So actually, whilst, yes, we might be in an abusive relationship and our abuser has an awful lot of responsibility towards where our self-esteem has ended, we're also contributing to it. Yeah. And we will do it on a daily basis. I still pull myself and think, no. don't use the word, don't use the word. Only use the word sorry when
Yeah.
you have consciously done something that has impacted negatively on another person that you shouldn't have done. Then say it, look them in the eyes, make it unconditional, and explain why you are sorry. But otherwise, try not to use that word.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now we come on to the word no. Such a small word, and people struggle so much with turning around to someone and saying no, because it feels like we're slapping them in the face.
Yeah.
It feels like we're not a nice person, we're not a good person if we're doing that. So we're going to take a self-esteem hit anyway. Okay. There's lots of ways of saying no without using the word no. I actually learned this very early on in my army career, because as a young private soldier, you would get spammed for things at short notice, like waiting on in the sergeant's mess until like kind of 6 o'clock in the morning. You get paid a fiver to do it, and it was a job you really didn't want.
Yeah.
So someone would come up to you with the rank and say, what are you doing this evening? And if you went, too slow, be outside the sergeant's mess at 7 o'clock this evening, dressed in whatever. And you couldn't say no. You know,
No.
private soldier, you can't turn around to a senior NCO and say no. Oh, you can, but you know, the consequences.
It's not going to go well.
No. So I got spammed once. I did that duty. I didn't enjoy it. And I said to myself, that's not happening again. I need a strategy whereby they go and look for somebody else. So I have a conversation in my head, or some wording in my head that is readily prepared and that gives me time to get away from the panic of someone putting me on my toes and saying, can you do this for me?
Yeah.
So let's take it into the workplace, and you're really, really busy, and a colleague says, oh, I'm really struggling with this. It's home time. And they say, I'm really struggling with this. I'm going to have to work a couple of extra hours this evening to get through this. You couldn't do me a favor and stay behind and help me with it. That way it'll only take an hour and we'll have it done. There is nothing wrong in saying, yes, of course I will. You know, that's about being a nice person.
Yeah.
But if we always say yes, then we will always be the one who gets asked.
Yeah.
Because people
Yeah.
don't ask favors of people who have a track record, turn around and say, you've got to be kidding, I'm not doing it. Do it yourself. So you become a victim of your own conscientiousness. So it's important that within your arsenal of responses, you have something that is not an unconditional yes. So you want me to help you out this evening, Lucy, with all that work you've got after this podcast? Lucy, I'd love to. But on this occasion, I can't, because I've got to visit someone in hospital. I've got a parents' evening. I've got, you know, origami lessons at college, or whatever it might be. Now, if you listen to that, I didn't say sorry, and I didn't say no. What I said, I soft delivered it, but I clearly delivered it. Unfortunately, on this occasion, I can't.
Yeah.
So if you ask me in a couple of weeks' time, same question, if I can, and I'm minded to, I
Yeah,
will.
I will. Yeah.
But on this occasion, I won't.
Yeah.
Now, some people say don't justify. Just say, sorry,
I mean,
on
I
this occasion, I
can't.
can't.
Yeah.
I think you have to decide what your relationship with the individual who's asking is,
Yeah.
and what
To be
feels
able to,
comfortable and
yeah.
what you think is necessary. I prefer to give an explanation. It's not an excuse. It might not necessarily be 100% true and honest, but I'm safeguarding myself. It
Self-care.
might be it's because I've got a romantic tea planned for this evening. Now, I don't want to say to the individual, because I've got a romantic tea planned for this evening.
Yeah.
So I'll just say I've got a parents' evening, or I've got, you know, another engagement. So it's respecting yourself. It's also respecting the other person.
Yeah.
And it's not just simply giving a no to them.
Yeah.
So it's important to safeguard and to be able to kind of set these boundaries
Definitely.
retrospectively when something is put on our toes.
Mm.
You know, assertiveness it's a funny word, assertiveness. I was once asked by a department within GMP, Greater Manchester Police, to provide some assertiveness training. And it was for individuals who answer the phone. You know, when something horrendous has happened and on the news they say, here's a free phone number if you want to
Yes.
find out if your loved ones have been involved in it.
Yeah.
It's the people who pick the phone up. And they have very tight instructions. There's very little actually that they are allowed to say.
Yeah.
Okay. The list of what they're not allowed to say is much longer. And that means it's a tough gig because people are emotional, they're worried, they're angry. They phone someone up and that person saying, I can't tell you that. Or I don't know, or whatever, we don't know yet. And so I was asked to give them some assertiveness skills, some assertiveness kind of training. And so I kind of explained what that would entail. And the individual who was a trainer turned around to me and said, I can't have you giving an input where you're going to tell people to be kind of rude or loud or anything like that, or disrespectful to the caller. And I thought, no, you just don't understand what assertiveness is.
Exactly,
And,
assertive.
you know, bottom line, assertiveness is not loud, it's not rude, it's not selfish.
Yeah.
It is simply putting your needs and wants, wants are important, your needs and wants equal to other people's.
Yeah.
So that you give yourself, as that example before with helping you late this evening, you give yourself a real viable option. You empower yourself to turn around and say, actually, on this occasion, I'm not going to be giving you what you've asked for.
Yeah. And like you say, not a no in sight, you know.
No, or a sorry.
Or a sorry. Yeah. And it is, you're right, we're so conditioned over time to think that saying no is a bad thing.
Rude or
It's a negative
disrespectful,
thing, and disrespectful and all that. And you know, maybe it is partly generational. I'm not sure what generations are like these days, although I have to admit, I don't think my children would necessarily say no to me. Or you know, I find it's a word I've always struggled with, saying no, definitely.
And what we're not saying here is that no is a bad word. I've said it's a difficult word to say.
Yeah.
There are times when we absolutely would be well advised to use the word no, to turn around to someone and say, no,
Yeah.
that stops and that stops now. That is unacceptable. I'm not putting up with that. You change your behavior now, or there are consequences.
Yeah.
So there are times when no is absolutely the best word, but it's like any word. If you overuse it, it dilutes its meaning, it dilutes its currency.
Yes.
You know, if we are always saying no to people, then that's what they expect, and it doesn't really mean much, especially if there are no consequences afterwards. You know, it's like parenting, and dealing with a bully is a bit like parenting. You know, you have to be as good as your word. If you say to a child that if they continue to do something, there'll be consequences, and they continue to do it, there had better be consequences.
You have to follow. That's, I think, one of the hardest things for a lot of parents is to follow through. I was just thinking my children would probably be more of a in a minute, you know, if it was, could you just pick that up? Instead, they wouldn't say no, they'd say in a minute, which I think is a typical response from most children and teenagers. But I think when you get to that point with your children where you can say, that's absolutely not a problem, but there'll be a phone ban this evening, that thing will be picked up in 5 seconds flat, you know, and it's that discourse that you need, that conversation to be able to say, I'm not going to make this difficult, I'm just going to be a parent here. That's all I'm going to do is be a parent and say, that's absolutely fine, but this will be, and it is, my children have this, they've grown up with cause and effect. And I'm not quite sure if that came from kind of university and like philosophy and everything else that I was fascinated in, but I'm very much, you know, everything has an effect. If something happens, there will be consequences. Not necessarily always bad, there can be good consequences. You work hard at school, you work hard for a test, the consequences hopefully are that you'll get a good result. And I think that's
maybe here's an additional treat to acknowledge the hard work you put in.
Exactly. And that's where it can work both ways, can't it? You know, and language to me, and it is so powerful, especially around domestic abuse and in particular that post-separation abuse, where because you have potentially been in that relationship for a very long time, And not even just in a romantic relationship, it may be that you're now an adult and you've left a family home where one of your parents was the abuser, you know, and now saying no to a parent as an adult, knowing what you've experienced, is obviously going to be difficult. So having all these mechanisms and solutions in place to say, I don't need to say no, but what I can do is stop it before it goes any further.
And just to point actually in terms of post-separation abuse, which obviously can take the form of harassment, malicious communications, and stalking.
Yeah.
One of my roles is I audit body-worn video of police officers going to domestic abuse jobs.
Yeah.
And I see some fantastic practice, and I see some less than fantastic practice around that. But one of the things that I have picked up, and this is maybe a useful insight for some of your listeners who might unfortunately be experiencing some of this post-separation abuse, is if you are getting text messages or emails, WhatsApp messages, and all the other apps, I'm too old to really know how they work,
With you.
and they are unwanted, then it is important, as soon as you get to the point when you think this is unwanted, this is harassment, I don't want this, is not simply to say, please stop, but to say, please stop. This feels like harassment. I feel that you are harassing me, or I feel that I am being stalked, but get the word harassment in there, because the police will often ask around that, and police officers quite often in someone's home, with permission obviously, will look at text message history. And one of the things they're looking for is the point where the victim stroke survivor has turned around and said, I want you to stop, this is not acceptable. Because we need to make sure that the perpetrator knows that what they are doing is perpetration, it's not acceptable, and we want it to stop. And as soon as you've said that, everything that's on your text history after that, that is the same pattern, they can then formally use that as evidence of harassment. So it's important to kind of, get that clock ticking. Anything below this line, matey, is going to be seen as harassment. Stop. So that's just something to put in there.
That's so true. That is so true. And I think, again, when it comes to post-separation abuse and around that kind of, the unwanted gifts, as well as the communication, it could be sending things for the children. And as much as, it's understandable you want to send your children gifts, do that when you're with the child, repeatedly sending things to the victim parent's home, regardless of whether it's designed for them or the child, is there as a reminder, a constant reminder that they are still around, that they are still in control. And again, like you say, it's getting that in there, getting that conversation in there. And, sometimes I've actually got to the point with people where I've said, block them on email. If the children are a bit older, and you're at the point now where they're not toddlers, they're not, something where you have to have that constant communication about things. There isn't a need for conversation. If the teenagers have phones, but they're still living with you, they can make that arrangement as to when they see the parents. You maybe can cut out communication altogether if it gets to a point where the children are a certain age.
And I think, the word block, it's an interesting one. It comes up quite often because what is the advice? Block them. If you block them, you protect yourself through that means, but you might actually be upping the ante. If you block them, you cut off continued evidence of their crimes. But it's a very personal thing, that there are people that say, no, you shouldn't say block. I think ultimately it's about giving that information, giving the context to an individual and empowering them to make an informed decision that is in terms of what they feel is best for them, potentially for their children as well, that they have responsibility for, and making that decision and then being supported in that decision but making it from an informed position. So I don't think it's a black and white. I think
No.
it's about explaining, taking the time to explain to an individual and saying, here are the pros and cons.
Yeah.
This is, if you do block, this is what to be wary of.
Yeah.
If you just block one means, does it just come up in another means, but all the more because you've now hacked them off because
Yeah.
you've taken away some of their control. They can no longer WhatsApp you.
Yeah. It's got to be down to that. It's got to be down to each individual situation, isn't it? And every situation's unique, even though there will be similar threads. Every situation is unique. And I think, I think the term block comes from, like you say, social media, isn't it? It's that block somebody on Facebook, or, block a troll, or whatever you call them. I don't even know when people are mean or whatever, I don't know. But this whole idea of blocking has sort of stemmed from that. But again, like you say, for some people it might work, depending on the situation. Sometimes it, like you say, can escalate things. You block them on what it doesn't mean if you block somebody on social media that stops anything. They can use friends, they can use work colleagues. Oh, you just look this person up. Can you just have a look at this? There's many, many ways that they can still continue to stalk and harass by other means. So yeah, it may make you feel that you've cut that side off, but it doesn't mean that they're not able. I had a lady called Charlotte Hooper on a while ago from Cyber Helpline, and talking about the level now of, we used to think of stalking and harassment as an in-person crime, and now it's the technology behind it now, the trackers, the ways that stalking the children through the apps that they use, I'm not, children's games and all that.
There was an instance in Manchester, where you talk about trackers, where a woman, post-separation, history of domestic abuse, controlling, coercive relationship, wherever she went in her car, if she went shopping, if she went yoga, if she went to visit a friend, when she came out to her car, there was one of those Rizzler papers under the wing, under the wiper.
Yeah.
Her ex-partner smoked roll-up cigarettes. She knew exactly who had put that there, and that was his way of saying, I know where you are. Wherever you go, I know where you are.
Wow.
Because
I
there was a
shouldn't be
tracker on
surprised, but wow.
because there was a tracker on the car. So there are so many different ways. Technology is a wonderful thing, but it's also, when it works against you, is an absolute curse and is very difficult to extract yourself from.
Yeah, and take that advice, and like you said, it is down to what works for one person won't necessarily work for another. You have to think of your situation and
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think, I mentioned stalking. Stalking is something nationally the police were found to be underutilizing as a crime. They were using harassment and malicious communications, and those are lesser crimes with a smaller levy on them in terms of punishment. Stalking is much more serious. So let's just give that definition of what stalking is. And it has eunomic. I can never say that word.
Oh, mnemonic. Yes, I know what you mean. I only remember from school.
FOUR. So the behavior towards you needs to be fixated.
Yeah.
It needs to be obsessive. So fixated, it just carries on and on and on. It's obsessive because if you block one way, they find another way to assert, coming to your place of work and so on and so forth. It needs to be the unwanted. Okay, but that's where it comes, where you put something in a text message and say, stop, I don't want this contact. It feels like harassment and I want you to stop. There you've proven it's unwanted. And the last one is repeated. So for stalking to be stalking, there has to be more than one occurrence. 2 occurrences is fine, but there has to be more than one. It can't be just one off once they come to your place of work and shout up at your window. That's harassment.
Yeah.
If they're doing that multitude of times, stalking. And sometimes, there's no harm if you have that contact with the police. Use that language, because they'll have their body worn video on. So you're being recorded and they are being recorded. And if you are seen and heard as saying, this feels like stalking to me, I think this fits stalking, you made it very difficult for them to
not
discount that.
Yeah.
because they're going to have to log that in some way. And they're going to have to rationalize why they have not crimed it as stalking, especially as they have now been told by the Home Office, you start with stalking and you see if you can't, if you have to discount it from stalking, then it goes down to something else. But you don't start with harassment and malicious communications. You start thinking stalking, and then you move away from that if it can't meet that criteria. So yeah, I want to kind of go back. Sorry, I wrote my list in a random order. So if it's okay with you, and I know it's your podcast, not mine. I want to give Mark's golden rule, and I also want to talk about one other area, very important area around self-esteem. So Mark's golden rule: your feelings are never wrong. Anybody who tells you your feelings are wrong, anybody who says, well, don't feel angry about that, don't feel annoyed about that, feel like this or feel like that. No.
Yeah.
Use of no. Your feelings are never wrong. Your feelings should not be what has to be forced to be changed.
Yes.
It's what is creating those feelings that needs to be modified. So if someone's behavior is making you feel scared, angry, frustrated, it's that person's behavior that needs to be looked at, reviewed, and challenged. Okay, your feelings are your feelings. They are never wrong, and don't let somebody tell you your feelings are wrong.
Yeah.
Okay, let's go on one of Mark's little visualizations again. So you're in the kitchen, you open the fridge door, you take out the carton of milk, and you drop it. It goes all over the kitchen floor. Yeah. And regardless of how full your glass might or might not be, there will be some internal expletives.
Yeah. One or two.
That voice inside us, that on that occasion might say, and I'll try not to swear on your podcast,
It's happened before.
you clumsy sausage, you silly pudding or whatever, or probably a little bit more colourful.
Yeah.
That internal voice, become more aware of it. When does it speak, and what language does it use? And for the majority of people, it speaks when we perceive that we've done something silly, wrong, stupid, clumsy, whatever. And the language it uses is critical. You clumsy idiot. What do you do that for?
Yeah.
Let's simplify things, and let's say that internal voice is your self-esteem. So again, we're feeding ourselves. The only time we talk to ourselves, it's to point out what we shouldn't have done, what we shouldn't have said. Become aware. You would set this as a piece of homework for people. And the first step is to become aware of it. Don't do anything to change it, but become aware of it. When does it happen? Where does it happen? Does it only happen at home, but it doesn't happen at work at all? Does it only happen when a certain person is around? And what is the kind of language that's using towards you? Once we then kind of discuss that and what that looks like, then we start to build in, starting to challenge it, changing that dialogue, that internal dialogue, okay? Because that critical person inside us, that's our self-esteem, we need to work to actually make that person our best friend. The person who pats us on the back and says, hey, well done, good job there. That's a nice thing to do. Well done. I have a thing in my life that I consciously, at least once a day, do something that is just unconditionally nice, that is a good thing to do. You shouldn't have to make an effort to do those things, and I'm not saying I do. But then connect with that and just say to yourself, that was a good thing to do, well done.
Yeah.
Okay, and that's all it needs to be. So, and people sometimes look at that and think, well, that's kind of makes me feel silly saying kind of things like that to myself. So it makes you feel silly. It seems like a silly thing to do to say, hey, Well done, Lucy. That's a really good job. That's a really nice thing to done. Well done. So that feels a bit silly. But turning around to yourself and saying, that was really clumsy, that was stupid, that isn't silly. Well, why is that not silly?
Yeah.
Because it's habit, because we've always done it.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
if we practice doing the silly but good stuff, it will replace it. It will become the normalized pattern that we have. And that internal voice will become our friend. It will become the one that pats us on the back and says, hey, come on, you can do it.
That's what we need. That's what I think that's what we all need, is that, being able to say, actually, I am capable. We're always so critical of ourselves, aren't we? I think as human beings in general, but then add all the other things that happen throughout your life, all the challenges you face, then finding that kind of inner voice to say, no, I can do this. I can do this. It's such a simple thing to say, isn't it? But
And we kind of go full circle because now we're back about, feeding self-esteem.
yes.
And we're back about actually what is inside us as individuals that
Mm,
we can utilize to improve our position, to improve our outlook, to improve our sense of optimism and hope for the future. And that optimism and hope comes from seeing what's inside us that can get us there, connecting with our own strength, our own coping strategies, our own problem solving skills, and saying, actually, no, I can, life at the moment is a little bit crappy, but I can best this. I can, I can move this to where I want to get it. And also, you don't have to do, you've alluded to this, Lucy, you don't have to do this on your own. Putting your hand up and asking for help is not a weakness. It is not a weakness. It's a strength. It takes courage, and it is a very important early step towards getting there. And anything that takes courage, you're proving to yourself that you're worth taking the courage for.
absolutely.
So, and if you go and see someone and you think this is just isn't doing it for me, I just don't connect with them or whatever, you can disengage and look somewhere else.
Yes.
My experience, not everybody is the right person for everybody. There has to be that kind of connection, there has to be that quick kind of trust and respect that gets put in place where you think, I can sit down opposite this person, I feel safe. And whilst I might not disclose everything on day one, I'm definitely going to come back for a day two.
You're right. Absolutely. I think finding the right connection with somebody when it is support, and I think as well timing. I say this so often. Timing is everything, and one of the main, in fact, the main reason I started the podcast, I started the website was because I saw people who would come for support. It may not have been the right time for them, so they do a bit, then leave, then re-refer themselves, and then they're on the waiting list again. And I just saw this, and I thought, if you could break that pattern, if you like, and say, okay, you may not feel comfortable in those settings, but there is something here for you where you're getting that, it's almost like they're sitting with us and having that conversation. So it takes away that intimidation, it takes away that fear. You're finding things out that you would have found out through other channels, but you're doing it on your time when you want to. You're taking back control, and that for me was the biggest element of doing all of this, was to say, it's up to you. You take it back.
And
you empower.
timing is critical. It has to be the right time for that individual. And I would often say when I saw a new client that the only thing I'm trying to achieve when I see a client the first time is to get to see them a second time.
Absolutely.
That's all I am trying to achieve. If they want to cathart for an hour, then in the next session, hopefully we start to unpack some of that. I might reflect some of that back and say, you mentioned this, can you expand on that? Can you tell me a little bit more about that so that I can understand? And then the work really begins. And even if someone comes to you the first time and then they say, I can't do this, I'm not going to come back, it is not wasted at all, because you can reinforce and say, you accept that, because support isn't something you can impose. That's called interference. Okay, support is something that somebody wants and they recognize that they want, and they accept the form that it takes. But you can say to that person, okay, I hear that and I accept that. I just want you to know, and give them really good eye contact. I just want you to know that this door is always open.
Yeah.
Okay. So if you want to come back in a day's time, a week's time, a year's time, the door will be open.
And that takes the pressure off, doesn't it? That takes that pressure off of saying, I've got to fix myself. I've got to do this. I've come this far. I've got to do it. All you have to do is put one step in front of the other and just try, try, isn't it? It's all about trying. And
And
very,
it's respecting that person's own autonomy and wisdom.
yeah,
And it's not putting an additional something in their glass by saying, right, well, I need you to phone me back within the next 7 days to
now you
confirm
have to do
one or the
this.
other. Why do you need that? Who's that
Yeah,
for?
yeah.
Who's it meant to be for? So, yeah.
Yeah, I absolutely, I do. I think timing is a massive element of it. And I think um very often as well, you can find with people that they will say, I didn't even know it was abuse until they may have read a book. They may have done something 10 years down the line. We all have, I think, again, society has this idea that if you are going to look for support, it's second you leave, that's it. If you're fortunate enough to leave, I will always say, then you go into support and that's that, done, dusted, wash your hands of it all.
Yeah.
No, it can take a long time for people to actually process the fact that what they were experiencing, again, Age UK, Carrie Bauer, that I did an episode with, that some people who've been married for 40, 50 years to then come out of a relationship like that and then have to admit to yourself somewhere down the line that actually this is what you've experienced. It can take a very long time. Some people may never realize that that's what they've experienced. And if you do, and if you do think that you're even slightly resonating with any of what we've been saying, then another thing I'll always say is there's absolutely no shame in picking that phone up and asking. Even if you're not sure, even if you think, well, they never actually, there was a great guest blog a divorce coach called Karen Kipping wrote for the website, and she entitled it, "Is it abuse if my partner doesn't hit me?" Now, it seems like such a simple question, but it's a question that so many people will say, well, they didn't hit me, so it can't possibly be abuse. If you're unsure, ask.
Especially when, historically referred to it as domestic violence, which
Yes,
paints the picture of physical. That's why I don't like domestic violence as a term. I prefer domestic abuse
I'm with you.
because
I say domestic abuse.
it
Yeah,
more openly encompasses all the forms of abuse that there are, and that might well include physical violence, but it might
absolutely.
be emotional violence, it might be financial violence, but too many people don't think of emotional, financial as violence, but they do see it as being abusive.
Yeah,
So again, language is very important around that.
absolutely. Yeah, I think I just think this for me as an episode is something that I've really wanted to do, and to get those kind of points out there about the potential for, I always say, a life that you deserve, a life that's, and everybody deserves to be happy. As
Yeah,
human beings, we all deserve to be happy. And whatever that looks like, whatever that form it comes in or shape or form it comes in, but to ask for help is
yeah.
absolutely no shame in
And
it whatsoever.
and also that help is not just around coping with what's on your plate at the moment. What is incredibly important post separation is growth.
Yeah.
Because if I had a pound for every time, and I'm going to play with a bit of a swear word here, if I had a pound every time that usually a female client is sitting opposite me and they say, in terms of their relationship history, how come I always find all the bar stewards?
I believe
And
that.
actually, the smug answer,
Mm.
in the vast majority of cases, is you don't. They find you, and
Mm.
they see in you a lack of boundaries,
Yeah.
and so on and so forth. They see someone who they can control, who has
Manipulate. Yeah.
open insecurities that they can play on
Yeah.
and be seen as like the rescuer, the strong person, but actually they're the abuser. Um, so it is incredibly important to grow, to understand what was going on and what can I do
Yeah.
to minimize the risk of it happening in a future relationship.
Absolutely.
And that's where things like language and assertiveness and self-esteem, all those building blocks are absolutely critical.
Yeah.
And also often we come out of a relationship and we look for that comfort blanket or an alternative comfort blanket straight away. I've got to get back into a relationship. I need a relationship. No,
Yeah.
you've been told you need a relationship.
Yeah.
At,
What you
at,
need
thi-
is time and space.
at this moment in time, the most important relationship you need is the one you have with yourself.
Oh, yeah.
And let's spend some time getting that in a healthy, good place, because then, one, you put yourself on a dating website, or you go down a local pub or wherever you meet people these days. You're much more likely to see red flags that otherwise you wouldn't have seen,
Yeah.
and think, just a minute, no, 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 I've been there, I've had that.
Yeah. No, thank
No,
you.
it might be a red flag that I just walk away from. It might be a red flag where we sit down over a latte and I say, I've noticed when I say this, you react this way.
Yeah.
That causes me some concern, because
Yeah.
what are your thoughts on that?
Yes. Yeah.
Well, I don't know what you're talking about. It's
Yeah.
perfectly fine. Oh,
Yeah.
well, I'll just suck my latte and
And
I'll
then
be,
thank you very much, but goodbye. Yeah,
um,
absolutely.
yeah,
It's so much about, and again, I've written a blog a while ago about relationships, and there isn't that hopefully one day people will see that there isn't that pressure to jump into something else, and you do have the right to say, actually, I'm going to take my time. And again, if you have been in a marriage for a long time or in a cohabitation for a long time, finding yourself, if you like, we use these kind of cliche terms, but it's finding out who you are now, not who you were before you met the person. Very often people say, oh, I'm a different person than I was before. Well, we're all different people from who we were before we were, in a relationship, or when we were 17 to 46, in my case, nearly. And yes, of course, we evolve, we grow, we change, we pick things up along the way, we learn things, we make mistakes, we do all these things. But to me, it's not about saying goodbye and that's it, because that was an abusive relationship and that's that. It is actually, what I've learned from that is this, and I'm going to carry that with me, but in a healthy way, to say, no, I don't want that anymore, or that, or
yeah.
that. Yes, please to this, and yes, I'm going to try, a new career or whatever it may be. And I think you do take that element of you with you for the rest of your life, but it doesn't have to define who you have become.
And I think within what you were saying there, Lucy, is something that I feel I've got to cover. And it might sound a little bit strange or even a little bit kind of offhand, but out of the most terrible things that happen in life come green shoots of possibility. And I'm going to give an example, and it's a domestic abuse example. So when I was in the army for my first 14 years, I was a medic. For the last 8 years, I was in army welfare. And I went to visit wife of a soldier. There'd been domestic abuse. She had also made attempts on her life, very controlling, coercive. He had also had an affair with the next door neighbor. So the first thing we did, we got him out of the house, and he went into single accommodation. He wasn't allowed to come back to the house. So she had that physical safety, and she had a young daughter as well. And I would visit, and on one occasion, she made me a coffee. And she apologized, and she said, I'm sorry, I hate this coffee. It's not nice coffee, but it's what he liked, and I wasn't allowed to buy any other make of coffee. So we chatted about all the things we were chatting about, getting her accommodated, daughter, and so on and so forth. And I came back to that, and I said, are you okay if I put a suggestion to you? The next time I come down, we don't have to, but give it some thought. Next time we come down, we'll go down to the local spa shop and do a little bit of shopping and maybe pick up some coffee. And we went in, she picked up one of those wire baskets, and went straight to the coffee. And she just stood there for what felt like an age.
Yeah.
And there was a real palpable emotion in this. And it's one of the only about 3 or 4 times where I've actually started to well up a bit. And eventually a hand went out like in slow motion, and she got a jar of coffee and she put it into a basket. There's a little bit of me that went, yes, because it was Dow burst, and that's my favorite incident.
Okay, I mean, I don't drink coffee, but I've heard of that.
But that's just a happy coincidence.
Yeah.
And we went and paid for it, and then we had a coffee back at her home. That is a green shoot. That was, and I fed that back. You're now drinking something that a couple of weeks back you couldn't drink.
Yeah.
Okay. That is an opportunity you now have to start making, very scary, but to start making decisions for yourself and empowering what your life looks like.
Yeah.
And some of those decisions are very big and very scary.
Yeah.
But if we start with the little things like get comfortable drinking Dow Egberts, just accept that that is your right,
choice,
and you are exercising your right, and never again will you not have Dow Egberts.
Yeah, you know, I'm really glad you said that, because you know, when sometimes when we read things or as professionals but writing things down, and we'll give it a very generalized view around, say for example, you know, coercive control, it's the clothes you wear, the food you eat, da da da. That's all great because that's a sentence and we put it all in there. But to actually get to give an example of something as simple, and that's how true it is, as simple as the coffee you drink, the tea bags you buy,
Yeah.
you know, the biscuits, whatever it is, the perpetrator has decided that that's what, you know, this is how it's going to be. So the victim survivor has fallen into line with that and done it. And to try and get that across to people, that it is as simple as the coffee that you drink and the coffee buy, that now that is empowering. It's that moment. Yeah.
It aligns to something you said earlier on, Lucy, when you said people feel that they've lost themselves, who they are. And this is about starting to reclaim that bit by bit, because whilst what I would say is you haven't lost the person you were, you've lost touch with the person you were. All of that is still inside you. It's who you are. It's in your DNA.
Yeah.
But you've been pushed away from it bit by bit by bit by bit over a period of time. You can't just take it all back in one go. Psychologically, that's just too much of an ask.
Yeah.
And no one should expect you to or ask you to.
No.
So let's start with something symbolic, something strongly symbolic, like the coffee you drink.
Yeah.
And that proves to yourself, that gives a message that actually I can start to make my decisions. And whilst that might be scary, it's bloody empowering too.
Yeah.
And what a way of giving a non-verbal statement to your abuser.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And from that, things will grow. That's that, things like that are that first step, aren't they? And it is, you're right, it is. I love it. I think to be fair, this has been a rather, I think, well, I can't think of any, well, we probably could cover a lot more, but you know.
Can I cover one more thing very quickly?
Of course.
And the reason why is because it's quite topical at the moment. It certainly is for the police. I've just written a paper on it.
Oh, right.
Victim blaming. Yeah. Language that is used not just by police officers but by professionals across the board, and you know, friends and all the rest of it, usually without realizing they're doing it. So things like you know, maybe you shouldn't have had anything to drink. You know, what were you wearing?
Yeah.
You know, why didn't you lock the front door?
Yeah.
Things like that. You know, let's be quite clear. And I said it earlier on, actions taken by a perpetrator are never, under any conditions, is it acceptable to apportion any amount of the responsibility for those actions on the victim. What somebody was wearing, their level of sobriety, where they were, so on and so forth. No.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that is something that certainly within training that we are looking to do now with police officers is one of the things that's going to be pushed quite hard, because we see it on the body worn video. And often I don't think officers are aware that they are doing it or meaning to do it. So we need to help them to be aware, and we need to give them alternative dialogue that can be used. One of the questions I want to see used at domestic abuse incidents very early on in the visit is an officer turning around to the individual and saying, as a result of us being here today, what would you like to happen?
Yes.
Yeah, that's empowerment, because you don't support somebody by telling them what you're going to do for them.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
not support.
And it's opening that question, isn't it? Rather than the yes, no answers. You want somebody to trust you enough to give you that information, because again, especially if there's been an incident, for that person, they may not be able to remember everything at that moment in time. There's all sorts of things going on, and it may take time, and it is that patience, isn't it? And it's all about the language we use. It's about giving people time, and respect. Respect is a big part of it for me. And I think that you're right. If officers understand, and if they know that the way that they say things has a huge impact on how somebody is going to respond to you, then things can start to change.
And I think it's perfectly legitimate for a victim in that setting to certainly ask themselves, even if they don't ask the police officer that's attending, of the police officer, if I were your sister or brother in this situation, would you be dealing with this in the same way?
Yeah.
Because you should be.
Yeah. That's a bit. Yeah, that should be in the training, shouldn't it? Imagine if this was your mother, father, sister, brother.
It's one of the things I have on my kind of checklist. I have areas that I cover, and then I have one or two questions in there, and it's on that sheet of paper that I use as a template every time I audit body-worn video, because it is not just about doing technically the right things.
No.
This is not just about output. This is about outcomes, and this is a very human interaction. This is a key interaction. We are talking about an area of crime where the crime happens a multitude of times over a prolonged period of time before someone either finds the courage or the desperation to put their hand up and say, help. It is absolutely critical that the first experience they have, which is very often the police, is a positive, honest, respectful one, and an empowering one. And we need to make sure we get that right. And a lot of the time, the police are getting it right. And certainly the training they get now is a lot better than it was before.
Right.
But you can never rest on the laurels and say, that's it, we're there, we're doing it. No, you've got to continue.
Yeah, and because, again, what we were saying earlier about stalking and harassment in person, how that's all evolved, domestic abuse will continue to evolve. And therefore, our understanding of it, the training around everything is going to have to keep evolving. We can't stand still and say, well, I asked the right questions, so it's all good now. Things will continue to evolve over time. And that's where we need to be constantly reassessing, understand better, do better. And then maybe people will speak out.
And the best way of understanding how domestic abuse is evolving is to listen to the victims of it.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. Yeah, absolutely.
So
they know better than anyone.
How has it manifested itself for you? How has this abuse shown itself for you? How has it impacted on your life?
Yes. Yeah.
We need to keep our toe dipped in that pool all the time so that we understand it, and so that the support that we're offering and the resources we've got and the law that we've got support what the need is.
Absolutely. Oh, Mark, thank you. Thank you doesn't seem enough, because we've covered, I can't even say how much we've covered, but we've covered more than I could have hoped for, shall we say. And I really do hope that if people are listening, if they are watching it, then and it does resonate, and not just necessarily with themselves, if they think that there's a family member, a friend, on the website, there's all the Clare's Law, etc. links. If there's somebody you're concerned about or worried about, you can go and, make those inquiries. And it's important that we all consider domestic abuse a lot more than we do, and realise that it is out there and it is going on daily for people. But then there's people like you out there fighting the good fight, so we keep going.
And people like you fighting the good fight.
Keep trying.
Yeah, and it's great that we're kind of having these conversations and everyone's looking to work together and complement each other's efforts.
Yeah, absolutely. And we'll keep doing it, definitely.
Good.
Thank you so much, Mark.
Thank you, Lucy.
I'll speak
Take
to you
good care.
soon.
Cheers.
Where